You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
You're listening to the Great Plains Archaeology Podcast. Join me as we uncover the rich histories of North America's Great Plains, exploring the latest archaeological discoveries and past cultures that shape this storied region. Welcome to the podcast. Welcome to episode 16 of the Great Plains Archaeology Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Carlton Shield-Chipkover, and I'm thrilled to have you join me on this exciting journey through the rich and fascinating histories of North America's Great Plains. So last episode, 2 weeks ago, right, we talked about broad strokes, the woodland period in the Great Plains. And I know we've focused a lot on the Central Plains in particular. That is the region between the Missouri River in the east and the Rocky Mountain Front Range in the west, and encapsulates Nebraska, Kansas, eastern Colorado, eastern Wyoming. And for those of you that are familiar with me, you know why. For those that are not as familiar with who I am, that's my region, is the Central Plains, where I focus my labor and research. And so it's just much more easier for me to off the cuff talk about the archaeological record here. And there's a lot of, especially when it comes to the Middle Woodland period, which we discussed in the last episode, there's really only a Hopewell in the Central Plains, in that eastern part. So there's a lot of focus on the Central Plains because that is where the Missouri River, right, gets into the Great Plains proper. And that is a major conduit of commerce, travel between groups, as we've discussed previously. And so the Hopewell period in the Middle Woodland, right, there's still a lot more work to be done. I need to sit down and read a recent dissertation about Hopewell ceramics. And so I need to sit down and do that out of a individual who defended their thesis back in December, or they, got their PhD back in December. Anywho, today we're going to be looking at that transition between the late woodland and the Plains Village period, specifically the early Plains Village period. So we're looking at a time frame between 500 AD and 1400 AD. So really coming into these past 1500 years. And although the Hopewell settlement pattern or the Hopewell style of communities and populations across the Great Plains have changed, transformed, or left, there's this period, especially in the Great Plains after the Hopewell folks in the Eastern Plains are gone, where we're seeing a lot more of the archaeological record become more visible. People are beginning to, especially in the late woodland period, starting to become more sedentary. There's much more evidence of early use of domesticates, such as maize, beans, squashes, goosefoot, these things. And, the late woodland period, if you look at some of those old books, they'll say late woodland is from 500 AD to 1000 AD. Our understanding of the woodland period and its decline has changed. So really late woodland, as Mary Adair has talked about and my research has shown, late woodland lifestyles of largely hunting and gathering. In the Eastern Plains, it's deer. Western Plains, it's predominantly bison, supplemented by a little bit of horticulture. It doesn't just go away at 1000 AD, at the beginning of this early Plains Village period, that there are late woodland communities or people that practice this hunting and gathering lifestyle well into 1200. And down the river from the Missouri, right around, the turn of the millennium in about 1050, we're seeing the rise of the Mississippians. The Mississippian societies, Cahokia being a big one. So elsewhere, to the east of the plains, there are populations that are reorganizing, adopting, or continuing a social stratification, like what we believe was happening with the Hopewell. And the Missouri River is this conduit between the plains and the Mississippians. And so there's a lot of interaction continuing between the Midwest, Southeast, Ohio River Valley, Missouri River Valley, basically the broad Mississippi River drainage. People are interacting with one another. And it's around this time period that we are also seeing ethnogenesis, or we're seeing around 1000 AD, 1200 AD, the framing of some of these archaeological cultures being identifiable to contemporary indigenous populations throughout the Great Plains. So, as I've seen in my work, many oral traditions that talk about the past as they relate to the Pawnee, Wichita, and Arikara can be dated to this time period. Like, they're actually talking about these archaeological taxa and saying, like, no, this is where we used to live in this spot. This is what we were doing. And so now we're actually able to be able to connect the record more concretely to specific groups. Whereas, like, when we talked about in Paleo-Indian, it's like, well, Clovis is probably ancestral to everybody, right? Archaic. Yeah, geographically, these are probably ancestral to some groups, like large scale, broad stroke, like probably ancestral to a lot of these groups. Now we're at like, oh no, the Central Plains tradition, that's Pawnee and Arikara. Like, we know that. Or Oneota, that's ancestral to all the Siouan groups that belong to the Hegan speaking Siouans, the Iowa, Poncas, and all them. That's that group. So now we're at this really fun juncture in archaeology where we can look at ancestral populations of modern day tribes. So what's driving a lot of this transition from these hunting and gathering life ways in the late woodland period to the early Plains village period? And it's agriculture. That's the big one. It is the adoption of agriculture. But the early Plains village folks are not full-blown agriculturalists yet. So looking back at the Central Plains again, there are folks in the Mississippi River drainage generally with maize-based domesticates. There's some cool stuff going on in northwest Iowa with Great Oasis these are early farmers, probably some of the earliest farmers that appear in the Central Plains. These are not large-scale communities. We're talking about like a couple houses, one or two. If I recall correctly, Great Oasis, we're talking about rectangular houses, and they have corn. And they're at the turn of the century. So we're looking at like right around 1000 AD, northwest Iowa. We find there's a Great Oasis site actually in central Nebraska that has one of the earliest corn dates in Nebraska. And then out of that, we see the Central Plains tradition appear in central Nebraska. Previously, it was believed it was probably some sort of offshoot of the Mississippians, or they definitely had contact, maybe coming up the Missouri River. Recent understandings of the radiocarbon record, we're actually seeing late woodland folks in Nebraska in particular, central Nebraska off the Loup River, being introduced to maize through Great Oasis, whether these are Great Oasis populations or just through interaction, who's to say. And then we start seeing horticulture, maize horticulture appear in central Nebraska, and it begins to spread out to the Republican rivers, into Kansas, westward along the Missouri and the Nebraska side of the Missouri. And these are continuations of late woodland people who have adopted a maize horticultural lifestyle. These are still small communities. These houses are square, hipped roofs. You can go to one of these sites, Medicine Creek being one of them, look at some of these reports, and you'll see like a couple houses in a site, but that doesn't mean they're occupied contemporaneously. What they are is like probably what's happening is the lifestyle of the house. They build a house, as it becomes dilapidated, they build a new one, and they're practicing, they're growing crops along creeks and river drainages that feed into major rivers that aren't as susceptible to flooding, but they're more susceptible to drought than they are to flooding. And this is when, during the archaeological record, we're seeing houses appear, right? People have to stay in one place to farm. We're seeing fish hooks. We're seeing pipes. It's in this period in the Central Plains in particular, we're seeing a much more rich archaeological record. But it's not full-blown agriculture yet. We're not seeing these massive earth lodge or grass lodge towns that we associate the northern Caddoan speakers with. And keep in mind, in the western parts of the plains, all the way down from Texas up to Canada, still hunting and gathering lifeways. People go out west to hunt, and this has been a theme that we have talked about, audience, throughout the course of these 16 episodes, give or take a couple that might have been a little off the rails. The eastern parts of the plains, the closer you get to the Missouri River, that's where you're seeing a lot of more of the social changes and the archaeological record being more diverse. The western part of the plains is where people go to hunt bison. Now, that's not to say these are two separate populations. Looking at the Central Plains tradition again, we see there's settlements in the central part of the Central Plains, the Eastern Plains, but they have campsites in Colorado, in Wyoming, and they're hunting out there. And how do we know those people are related? Well, we see the pottery. There's some in the western parts of the plains, like in western Nebraska, we can see some goofy Central Plains tradition houses. They're not as, they're irregular. And a part of that is environmental determinism, meaning like the further west you go on the plains, the less abundance of straight timbers, strong timbers there are. So when people try to make houses out there, they're using with what they got. But particularly the pottery and the projectile points, that's the indicator that those campsites in the western part of the plains are being occupied or by folks from the eastern part of the plains who are going out there to hunt. We're seeing also during early Plains Village, this time period, roughly 950 to some points to 1300. Really, at least in the Central Plains, probably more like 1100 to 1300. Folks starting to understand behaviors of what you need to do to support large populations on the plains. And that is, if you're going to adopt farming, you can't solely rely on maize-based agriculture. You have to supplement it with bison hunting, like in large groups. So it's around this time period we're seeing societal practices become introduced in the record that later become increasingly evident as we get to contact with Europeans. And so if we look further up, this is the time period where the Missouri River really becomes important. In a later episode, I'm going to talk more about the Southern Plains and also more northern in Canada separately. But in the Central Plains, we see a great oasis coming in from northwest Iowa. There's something's going on in Nebraska. We only have the couple dates from the one Great Oasis site. And we have the Central Plains tradition take off. And we're going to go ahead and take a break. Sorry for that long thing. We'll be right back after these messages. Continue talking about this late woodland to early Plains Village transition. And we're back, continuing on this discussion between, late woodland to early Plains Village transitions. And the big thing here, like what's defining this Plains Village period, is settlements, is much more diverse pottery. Like in the woodland, we have these like conical pots, right? I need to find a citation for it because I think I've just been repeating this since I've learned this at CU Boulder during my PhD. Conical pots, based off of this old information, are really good for rendering bison lard based on the thermodynamics, the something of the pot and how it just distributes heat throughout the rest of the vessel. But now, like early Plains Village, like looking at Central Plains tradition, we're seeing like globular pots. We're seeing rims that are decorated, shoulders. Not in Central Plains tradition. We're not seeing decorated shoulders, not yet. But like we're seeing a lot more pottery, a lot more variation in the pottery, as well as the houses. We're seeing a much more settled people who are adopting a different way of life. And right around like 1250, 1300, after like Cahokia begins to decline, right? So like right when early Plains Village is taking off, like Cahokia is like at its peak, 1100. As it declines, some of these groups associated with the Mississippi hinterlands, like looking at the Great Lakes region, specifically Minnesota, we have a group called the Oneota Archaeology, Oneota Settlement Pattern Lifeways. That is a group from Wisconsin, the Great Lakes area of Wisconsin, moving southwest across Iowa and then into the Central Plains, which I think me and my advisor and I and Dr. Carlson, Casey Carlson, coined Central Plains Oneota. Maybe someone else said it, but we've used it, Central Plains Oneota. We can see that march across Iowa out of Minnesota into the Great Plains. And this is another early Plains village taxa. And they have, they're living in rectangular houses. They have different projectile points. They're coming in with pots with flared rims, decorated shoulders, while Central Plains tradition pots are more globular with decorated braced rims, no shoulder decorations. And there's conflict between the two. We can see evidence of violence between these two groups. But more importantly, what's more interesting is we see at Central Plains tradition sites the presence of Oneota pottery at times, but at all the Oneota sites, you'll never find Central Plains tradition pots. And so that can tell us a little bit about, maybe trade, maybe marriages occurring between this invasive, I don't want to say invasive, but this recent arrival group with some of the locals, but there is conflict, which is another aspect of this early Plains Village period is when you had, and the Plains Village period as a whole, but with early Plains Village in particular, we're seeing violence. We can see it in the archaeological record. That's not to say that it happened in the past by any stretch of the imagination. It's just that when people become more settled in one spot, they are growing crops, creating surplus of goods. People want that. So it's also in this time period that conflict becomes more easily identifiable in the archaeological record. And one of the reasons why I like working in the Plains Village period is because it is such a wealth of an archaeological record between the pottery, the points, the fish hooks, the houses, the trash pits, that there's so much more anthropology that can be done with farmers than you could say looking at the Paleo-Indian period. It's not to say that you can't do anthropology, but when you go to a Clovis site, it's cool, you have a bunch of butchered animals and a bunch of points and debitage. What can you learn from this? Whereas in the Plains Village period, it's okay, I'm in a settlement, I'm in a town with dozens, if not hundreds of houses, some of which weren't occupied at the same time. There's a breadth of cache pits to go through people's trash. It's a wholly different animal to understand the archaeological record. And not only do we have conflict between Oneota and Central Plains tradition, also relationship building. Central Plains Oneota by 1350 is gone at the latest from the Central Plains. And it's also during this time, during the early Plains Village period, we start seeing in the Central Plains the rise of the initial coalescent variant, which is these are CPT populations that are coalescing together first in northeast Nebraska and then resettling Nebraska. And how do we know they're Central Plains tradition people? Well, like I said earlier, Central Plains tradition, a couple houses, these square hipped roofed houses at a site called 25BD1 or the Lynch site. We're talking about dozens, if not hundreds of Central Plains tradition houses at this site with Central Plains tradition pottery. Also, there's some Oneota stuff there. And things massively change. It's also in the 1300s, we have the medieval global warming period. There's a lot of drought in this region. The Central Plains tradition horticulturalists are facing a severe climatic event where their crops aren't growing. And so we're seeing much more readily identifiable response in the archaeological record to ancestral populations having to cope with environmental conditions. Right, hunters and gatherers. It's not to say people that study that record from archaic to Paleo-Indian, early village, early woodland, not early Plains Village, that climate, drought, monsoon, whatever, didn't affect those populations, just harder to see it. Whereas farmers who rely on farming, so agricultural goods, horticultural goods, when things go bad for those folks, we can see it and we can see change occurring. And so what's driving these Central Plains tradition groups in Kansas and Nebraska to coalesce together into these massive towns? It seems to be drought, right? They're grouping up, coalescing, in order to overcome environmental stress. They don't do it right. So they don't do it. There's some how do I want to say? What I want to say is that there's this adaptive process. It didn't mean it solved everything. There's some evidence at Lynch that maybe they over-farmed the soil because these groups had not engaged in this like massive form of communal-ish agriculture, right? And I want to say like communal-ish. We don't know that all these, anywhere between 6,000 to 10,000 people did some like socialist style of farming. No, probably they all just got together, protection, and had farm plots. So some cool stuff happening, 1200. The Mississippian populations like Cahokia are depopulating. They're on the decline. People are voting with their feet. One way they go is easily up the Missouri River, right? Because like the St. Louis, where, Cahokia sits on modern day East St. Louis, like 200,000 people live there and in the suburbs of Cahokia. And it's just south of, where the Missouri and Ohio meet the Mississippi, right? Like that is a huge major trade center. And connecting back to a previous point that we made in the woodland episode last time, right? When we talked about Paleozoic and Archaic, we're talking about like early, middle, late. These are occurring over the time span of thousands of years that we're seeing these transitions, these markers of that differentiate different human behavior. Woodland, we're looking at like early as, roughly 500 BC to 180, and middle in the Hopewell is like 180 to like kind of 500. Late's 500 to 1000, 1200 AD. And then we're at Plains Village. It's like, oh yeah, early 10,000 to 1250, 1300, middle 1350 to 1600. And then we get into the contact, like things move quick, and it moved very quick in the Central Plains, where Central Plains traditions really only around from like 1100, 1150 to 1400. Initial coalescent variant, which is Central Plains tradition people, is starting around 1300 and existing until extended coalescent variant in the later Plains Village period to like 1600. Like it's so quick. Like the second people in the Central Plains in Nebraska and Kansas get access to corn, the transition from, the Mesolithic to the Neolithic is within 300 years. Like it is such a rapid transformation of lifeways, going from hunting and gathering populations, in 1000 or 950 AD to hamlet horticulture to full-blown plains towns of earth lodges of thousands of people. It happens within 500 years. That is insanely quick. And that comes with the conflict and the surplus and rock art and the fishing implements. Like the explosion of the material culture is just absolutely incredible. And we're going to look more closely in later episodes. We're still doing like these overhead views of what's going on in the Great Plains, and we'll talk more site specific again, like we did with Hopewell. Even Hopewell wasn't very site specific. That was like cultural taxa specific. We're going to look at some sites themselves. So we'll be looking more focused at some sites, and there's a couple I'm really excited about. Like Crow Creek is a site I really want to look at. It's a extended coalescent variant or initial coalescent variant. It's a coalescent variant site in South Dakota where like they had palisade walls. And that's another thing that comes with this early Plains village. How do you keep people out? And we're starting to see like defensive fortifications in the forms of palisades, battlements, towns being set up on bluffs and strategically defensive positions. Like you don't see this with the Middle Woodland period, right? These small bands of people wandering the landscape. Plains Village is where we see evidence for a lot more human behavior. And with that, next episode, we're going to talk about the Middle Plains Village period and dive into stay with the Central Plains. And then we'll start later on talking Southern, Northern Plains. So with that, I'll see you guys all next time. Take it easy. Bye. Thank you for listening to the Great Plains Archaeology Podcast. You can follow me on Instagram at Pawnee_archaeologist, and you can also email me at greatplainsarchpodcast@gmail.com. And remember, anybody can love the mountains, but it takes a soul to love the prairie. American author Willa Cather.
The Archaeology Podcast Network is 10 years old this year. Our executive producer is Ashley Airy, our social media coordinator is Matilda Siebrecht, and our chief editor is Rachel Roden. The Archaeology Podcast Network was co-founded by Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle in 2014 and is part of Cultural Media and DigTech LLC.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.